Behind me is a detail from one of about 600 paintings in Lascaux Cave in southwestern France, believed to have been created about 17,000 years ago. Now, paintings such as this one can be found in caves around the world, and many depict hunting scenes or what appear to be dance rituals among humans. Although anthropologists caution against being too quick to impose our modern interpretations on these very ancient works from very different cultures. But a few, controversially, seem to depict human beings in combat, which points us toward a crucial, albeit ultimately unanswerable question. Did humans in the Stone Age engage in organized violence? And tied in with that is the question of um, how far back have humans engaged in organized violence, which suggests, is warfare in effect transhistorical? Has it always been with us, which suggests that it always will be with us, or did it originate at a certain um, time and place and under a certain set of societal conditions, which suggests that we might be able to remake human society so as to eradicate war. So that is the, the key question in terms of looking at war before civilization. Now, let me share the screen with you. Always a bit of an awkward process. Here are the terms. By the end of this presentation, you should understand the nature of war before civilization, the basic unresolved question of whether human beings inherently engage in organized violence or whether organized violence has an historic beginning, and if so, the possibility of a future end. Next, the content and significance of the Seville Statement of 1986. Then John Locke's view of man in a state of nature. Locke believed that man in a state of nature essentially had no motivation for violence. In contrast to Thomas Hobbes' view of man in a state of nature as being inherently violent. Next, Charles Darwin's view that a willingness to risk death in war passed on the desirable trait of altruism and courage. And so, to that extent, that war before civilization um, actually made human beings better. And then finally, to look at the usefulness of studying war before civilization. What's the actual point of spending time with this? Now, as a prelude to examining the idea of war before civilization, I'd like you to view this scene from the 1981 film Quest for Fire. It's one of the few movies that doesn't play the Stone Age for laughs. I want you to watch it because I think it will really make you think about the question of whether early human beings killed one another. This practice would, of course, have been a prerequisite for anything resembling war, which would, of course, have required one group of human beings to be killing another group of human beings. Quest for Fire, which takes place about 50,000 years ago, assumes that they did, assumes that humans did kill one another, and assumes that this did occur in groups. Quest for Fire also assumes a world in which humans used fire but did not know how to start a fire. It was therefore imperative to keep a fire burning at all times. The film begins with a band of people who possess fire in the form of a carefully guarded small flame. And to the horror of the band, their flame is accidentally extinguished. And since they don't know how to start a fire, three of the men in the community are dispatched on a literal quest for a fire to replace the one they have lost. Now, the scene you're about to see occurs at a point near the end of the film in which the trio, now joined by a young woman, have stolen fire from a hostile band and are returning home only to be set upon by peer rivals from their own band who wish to take the fire and return it home themselves to enjoy the status that will confer.
No, bring up. No, 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 Arthur. No, no, many no, no, no,
Now, the origins of human society are a matter of educated guesswork. Broadly, we think that humans began as hunter gatherers and shifted to settled agriculture around 10,000 BCE. That stands for before Common Era. It's a way to avoid saying before Christ, which invokes the Christian tradition and tries to find a sort of religiously neutral way to express that particular term. We know that warfare was a characteristic of the first agriculturally based societies, but was it characteristic of earlier hunter gatherer societies? The physical evidence for this is equivocal. Now, this presentation assumes the theory of evolution and the idea that present day human beings, Homo sapiens, is the scientific term, evolved from precursor societies called hominids. Homo erectus, shown in this illustration, was the first to use stone tools. This began about 600,000 years ago. Modern humans emerged about 40,000 years ago. Initially, Homo erectus simply used stone chips. Gradually, their tools became somewhat more sophisticated, and they learned to create much sharper points and also to use spears. As with early humans, Homo erectus were hunter gatherers. They were organized into bands of perhaps several dozen persons, almost certainly members of extended families, and perhaps a few others adopted into the band. They grouped together for mutual protection, for the provision of food. Some members could actively hunt and gather fruits and vegetables. Others, the very young, very old, for instance, could not. From surviving evidence, it is possible that they engaged in simple religious rituals. If there were motives for violent conflict, these would have been over food and water sources in times of drought, sexual partners, and possibly what Native Americans would later call mourning wars. That is spelled Mourning, that kind of mourning war, which occurred when a community suffered losses that jeopardized the viability of the group. Quest for fire suggests that fire, which ordinarily, you just, hey, you need some fire? Yeah, here we go. We got some fire. We'll just, light your stick and off you go. It may have been, in Quest for Fire's terms, that having fire involved some kind of sacred significance. That there was a sense of a group that possessed fire, that there was something wrong with giving it away. That's the principal motivation for why in Quest for Fire, uh, the business of securing fire could provoke violence. But what we're talking about really is scarcity. Some kind of scarcity would have been a motive, perhaps, for violence and for organized violence. Now, there would have been no specialization of tasks in these early groups, save for perhaps for the care and rearing of young children. There would have been communal living with little or no personal property. Leadership would probably have been based upon consensus, so that essentially adult status was the only prerequisite for holding political or social power. And this was characteristic, this form of society was characteristic of the old Stone Age, formerly called the Paleolithic Age, defined as between 2.5 million years ago to about 10,000 BCE. By the start of the Neolithic Age, or New Stone Age, the more advanced people customarily lived in shelters made of wood, hides, sod, or bones, dressed in clothing sewn from skins, used dogs to control, insofar as possible, herds of wild animals, traded with other regions, painted and sculpted, participated in primitive rituals, and buried their dead. But did early human beings actually engage in organized violence? This specimen of Neolithic cave art found in South Africa is a kind of litmus test for the layperson. Does it show human beings engaged in some sort of ceremonial activity, or does it show two groups engaged in armed conflict? Anthropologists, scientists who study human societies and cultures and their development, are divided about the essential nature of Stone Age societies. But the dominant view is that Stone Age societies were peaceful. For an influential manifesto on this point, please read the Seville Statement, one of the readings assigned for this week. The argument is as much political as anything else. If people are naturally peaceful, it tends to argue that there is something morally corrupt about the contemporary state system. If people are naturally warlike, it tends to argue that the contemporary state's emphasis on armed security is well placed. Human beings, most of the time, cooperate. So why do they kill each other, especially in organized ways? Is this natural, somehow part of human makeup? Or is it a consequence of the way in which societies have organized themselves? If the former, it suggests that war is inevitable. If the latter, then war is an aberration that can be curtailed or ended. Now, obviously, we have no ability to discover how humans living in the Paleolithic era actually behaved, and consequently, no way to determine for sure whether they remained at peace or engaged in war. As an imperfect substitute, anthropologists have looked at present day societies living under essentially Neolithic New Stone Age conditions. Of prominent interest are the Yanomamo indigenous people living in the borderlands of Venezuela and Colombia. A number of anthropologists have interpreted these people as warlike, as this photo of Yanomamo children suggests. Others suggest, however, that this assessment is overblown, and that in any event, Yanomamo societies have been indirectly but importantly influenced by the more advanced societies that surround them, albeit at a distance of many miles. Other societies whose technologies are still essentially Neolithic may be found in other places, such as the highlands of New Guinea. Presumably, these resemble Neolithic societies in other ways too. Anthropological study of these societies gives us one of our best windows into what Neolithic warfare was probably like. Though it must be remembered that these are now among the world's most militarily backward societies, whereas real Neolithic warfare was cutting edge. One historian has argued that primitive war is characterized by, quote, tactics but no strategy, and continues this by saying that leadership is largely inspirational. Now, tactics refers to the techniques employed in or used in the employment of weapons. Strategy is a consciously made connection between a desired objective and the means at hand to achieve it. The key question can usually be expressed in this way. We wish to achieve a certain objective. How do we use our available resources in order to secure that objective? The warfare of New Guinea doesn't seem to follow this pattern. It seems to be ritualistic rather than strategic. This photograph shows two groups engaged in a formal battle at a set time and a pre-arranged field of conflict. Now, these conflicts are lethal. The weapons used are the spear and the bow and arrow. The bowmen attempt to wound in order to immobilize a foe who can then be killed by a thrown spear or a spear thrust. However, the engagements take place at such a distance, the contending sides are at such a distance from one another, that the combatants are usually able to dodge the incoming arrows and are expected to do so. Hence, no shields are used, and the contest is in considerable measure a test of the warrior's agility and skill in eluding the arrows. And the warfare, in any case, has no strategic purpose. Neither side is attempting to capture the other's village or supplies, for example. A final example that can be used to suggest that Neolithic societies made war is this so-called bone bed at Crow Creek, South Dakota, which dates back to 1325 AD and contains the remains of nearly 500 men, women, and children. From the marks on their bones and skulls, it's clear that these victims died violently. They were scalped, mutilated, and left exposed for a few months to scavengers before being buried. This certainly indicates that indigenous Americans made war, but doesn't offer any conclusive evidence about whether Neolithic societies made war. This leads us to important speculations about the nature of man or the nature of humanity in a so-called state of nature. And this comes from two really influential political philosophers who were concerned with the foundations of political power. John Locke, whose ideas influenced the American Revolution, they're found in the Declaration of Independence, argued that in a state of nature, men basically had all they needed and were basically content and had no motive for violence. They ceded their own personal authority to a leader in order to create an even better society through organized cooperation. And then Locke went on to say that when this leader no longer handled power responsibly, that these same men who had voluntarily given some of their power to that leader had the right to withdraw it again. And again, the foundation of Locke's political thought had to do with the idea that in the state of nature, men were basically content, had no motive for violence. This is somewhat the same as what many modern anthropologists think about humans before civilization. Now, Thomas Hobbes, on the other hand, was another English political philosopher concerned with the problem of achieving and maintaining a stable government. In 1660, he published a very famous and important treatise called Leviathan, which contained a thought experiment arguing that in a state of nature, men coveted the possessions of each other and used violence constantly in order to obtain those things they coveted. And his political argument was that men ultimately ceded their personal power to a strong leader capable of providing security and order above all else. So Locke's idea is that men ceded authority to a leader in order to create a better society for themselves. Hobbes, on the other hand, said they cede that authority in order to survive. They need a strong leader to create the conditions for order and security that will allow them to preserve their lives. And so, as for Hobbes, this is an important thing to remember about Hobbes. His portrait of humanity in a state of nature is often applied to the interstate system, the present day system between nation states, which by this analysis consists of international anarchy, in which each country ruthlessly pursues its own interest, and even diplomatic and military alliances are a function of that self-interest and change as conditions change. Thus, during the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies against their common enemy, Nazi Germany. But soon after the end of the war, they became geopolitical rivals who, among other things, threatened one another with nuclear destruction. By this analogy, sovereign states are in a situation almost identical to a Hobbesian state of nature. That is to say, the state of nature Hobbes postulated, in which humans were constantly engaged in a sort of a self-interested, ruthless pursuit for the things that they want and engaged in violence in order to get it. Then we come to Charles Darwin, best known for his theory of evolution, who thought that primitive war, or war before civilization, played a significant role in human natural selection. He devoted a full chapter to it in his book, The Descent of Man, published in 1871. And he argued that organized violence, that war elevated human virtues, not only intelligence, but also courage, altruism, and so forth. His basic argument was that warriors who survived held a status that gave them access to the best prospects for a mate, whereas those who died were honored by their societies, who protected their mates and their children, or held their families in a higher status that gave those families the best prospects for a mate. And thus, they were more likely to pass along their genetic inheritance, whether they survived or not, which Darwin, again, believed included physical courage and a penchant for altruism. In other words, Darwin saw these being embedded in some kind of way in human genetic patterns. Ultimately, then, the study of war before civilization is useful in understanding the nature of war. It helps in understanding the possible origins of war. It helps to inform the question of whether human beings are naturally warlike. And in addition, you need to be familiar with this Hobbesian concept of human beings being naturally violent in the state of nature. Because although simply a thought experiment, Hobbes' idea of the violence of human beings in a state of nature has been very influential in the study of international relations.